Section 10 of Psychological Types, or the Psychology of Individuation. Psychological Types, or the Psychology of Individuation, by Carl Gustav Jung. Translated by Hilton Godwin Baines. Section 10, Chapter 2, Schiller's Ideas upon the Type Problem. Part 1. Letters on the Aesthetic Education of Man. A. The superior and the inferior functions. So far as my somewhat limited range extends, Friedrich Schiller seems to have been the first to have made any considerable attempt at a conscious discrimination of typical attitudes, and to have developed a fairly complete presentation of their singularities. This important endeavor to represent the two mechanisms in question, and at the same time to discover a possibility of their reconciliation, is to be found in his treatise first published in 1795, Über die Ästhetische Erziehung des Menschen. The paper consists of a number of letters which Schiller addressed to the Duke of Holstein-Augustenburg. Schiller's essay, by the depth of its thought, the psychological penetration of its material, and its wide vision of the possibility of a psychological solution of the conflict, prompts me to a somewhat extensive presentation and appreciation of his ideas, for never yet has it fallen to their lot to be treated in such a connection. The merit due to Schiller from our psychological viewpoint, as will become clear in our further discussion, is by no means inconsiderable, for he gives us developed points of view which we, as psychologists, are just beginning to appreciate. My responsibility will, of course, not be light, for it may well happen that I shall be accused of giving a construction to Schiller's ideas which his actual words do not warrant. For, although I shall take considerable pains, at every essential point, to quote the actual words of the author, yet it may not be altogether possible to introduce his ideas in the connection I intend to establish here, without giving them certain interpretations or constructions. I am obliged not to overlook this possibility, but, on the other hand, we must bear in mind the fact that Schiller himself belongs to a definite type, and is therefore constrained, even in spite of himself, to deliver a one-sided characterization. The limitation of our conceptions and cognition becomes nowhere so apparent as in psychological presentations, where it is almost impossible for us to trace any other picture than that whose main outlines are already marked out in our own psyche. From various characterizations, I conclude that Schiller belongs to the introverted type, while Goethe inclines more to the extroverted side. We can easily trace Schiller's own image in his description of the idealistic type. An inevitable limitation is imposed upon his formulation through this identification, a fact which must never be lost sight of in our effort to gain a fuller understanding. This limitation is to be ascribed to the fact that the one mechanism is presented by Schiller in richer outline than the other, for the latter is still imperfectly developed in the introvert, and just because of its imperfect development, it must necessarily have certain inferior characters clinging to it. In such cases, the presentation of the author demands our criticism and correction. It is clear, too, that this limitation of Schiller's has also prompted him to use a terminology which fails in general applicability. As an introvert, Schiller has a better relation to ideas than to things of the world. The relation to ideas can be relatively more emotional or reflective, according to whether the individual belongs more to the feeling or to the thinking type. At this point, I would request the reader, who perhaps may have been led by my earlier publications to identify feeling with extraversion and thinking with introversion, would be good enough to bear in mind the definitions furnished in the last chapter. With the introverted and extroverted types, I have there distinguished two general classes of men, which can be further subdivided into function types, that is, thinking, feeling, sensational, and intuitive. Hence, an introvert can be a thinking or a feeling type, since feeling as well as thinking can come under the supremacy of the idea, just as both, in given cases, can be ruled by the object. If I then consider that Schiller, both in his nature and particularly in his characteristic opposition to Goethe, corresponds with the introvert, the question next arises as to which subdivision he belongs. This question is hard to answer. Without doubt, the factor of intuition plays a considerable role with him. We might, on this account, or if we were regarding him exclusively as a poet, count him as an intuitive type. But, in the Letters on Aesthetic Education, it is undoubtedly Schiller the thinker who confronts us. Not only from these, but also from his own repeated admissions, we know how strong the reflective element was in Schiller. Consequently, we must shift his intuitiveness over towards the side of thinking, so that we may also approach him from this other angle. That is, from our understanding of the psychological viewpoint of an introverted thinking type. It will, I hope, be sufficiently proved hereafter that this conception coincides with reality, for there are not a few passages in Schiller's writings that speak distinctly in its favor. I would, therefore, request the reader to bear in mind that the hypothesis I have just outlined underlies my whole argument. This is, in my opinion, necessary, because Schiller handles the problem from the angle of his own inner experience. In view of the fact that another psychology, that is, another type, would have apprehended the problem in quite another form, the highly general formulation which Schiller gives to it might be regarded in the nature of an encroachment, or as an ill-considered generalization. But such a judgment would be incorrect, since there is actually a large class of men for whom the problem of the differentiated functions is precisely the same as it was for Schiller. If, therefore, in the ensuing argument, I occasionally emphasize Schiller's one-sidedness and subjectivity, I do not wish to detract from the importance and validity of the problem he has raised, but rather to make room for other formulations. Such criticisms as I may occasionally offer, therefore, are intended rather as a transcription into a form of expression which disembarrasses Schiller's formulation of its subjective limitations. My argument, nevertheless, clings very closely to Schiller's, since it is concerned much less with the general question of introversion and extraversion, which in Chapter 1 exclusively engaged our attention, than with the typical conflict of the introverted thinking type. Schiller concerns himself at the very outset with the question of the cause and origin of the bifurcation of the two mechanisms. With sure instinct, he hits upon the differentiation of the individual as the basic motive. Quote, "It was culture itself which dealt this wound to the modern man." End quote. This one sentence at once shows Schiller's embracing understanding of our problem. The breaking up of the harmonious cooperation of the psychic forces that exists in instinctive life is like an ever-open and never-healing wound, a veritable amorphous wound, since the differentiation of one function among several inevitably leads to overgrowth of the one and to neglect and crippling of the rest. Quote, "I do not ignore the advantages," says Schiller, "which the present generation, regarded as a whole, and measured by reason, may boast over what was best in the bygone world, but it must enter the contest as a compact phalanx and measure itself as whole against whole. What individual modern could enter the lists, man against man, and contest the prize of manhood with an individual Athenian? Whence, then, arises this unfavorable individual comparison in the face of every advantage from the standpoint of the race?" End quote. Schiller places the responsibility for this decline of the modern individual upon culture, that is, upon the differentiation of functions. He next points out how, in art and scholarship, the intuitive and the speculative minds have become estranged, and how each has zealously excluded the other from its respective field of application. Quote, "And with the sphere into which man confines his operation, he has also made unto himself a ruler, which fact not infrequently results in the suppression of his other faculties, whereas, in the case of the former, the luxuriating power of imagination makes a wilderness of the laborious plantations of the mind. In the latter, the spirit of abstraction consumes the fire that should have warmed the heart and kindled fantasy." End quote. And further, quote, "When the commonwealth makes the office or function the measure of the man, when of its citizens it does homage only to the memory in one, to a tabulating intelligence in another, and to a mechanical capacity in a third, when here, regardless of character, it urges only towards knowledge, while there it encourages a spirit of order and law-abiding behavior with the profoundest intellectual obscurantism, when, at the same time, it wishes these single accomplishments of the subject to be carried to just as great an intensity as it absolves him of extensity, is it to be wondered at that the remaining faculties of the mind are neglected, in order to bestow every care upon the special one which it honors and rewards?" End quote. In these thoughts of Schiller there lies much weight. It is understandable that Schiller's age, whose imperfect knowledge of the Grecian world appraise the man of Greece by the greatness of his bequeathed works should thereby overestimate him beyond all bounds, inasmuch as the peculiar beauty of Grecian art owed its existence in no small measure to its contrast with the milieu from which it arose. The advantage of the Greek consisted in the fact that he was less differentiated than the modern, if indeed one is disposed to regard that as an advantage. For the disadvantage of such a condition must at least be equally obvious. The differentiation of functions is assuredly no product of human caprice. Its origin, like that of everything in nature, was necessity. Could one of these modern admirers of the Grecian heaven and Arcadian bliss have visited the earth as an Attic helot, he might well have surveyed the beauties of the land of Greece with rather different eyes. Even were it the fact that the primitive conditions of the 5th century before Christ yielded the individual a greater possibility for an all-round unfolding of his qualities and capacities, this nevertheless was possible only because thousands of his fellow men were admittedly cramped and crippled in wretched circumstances. A high level of individual culture was undoubtedly reached by certain figures, but a collective culture was quite unknown to the ancient world. This achievement was reserved for Christianity. Hence it comes about that, as a mass, the moderns can not only rival the Greeks, but by every standard of collective culture they easily surpass them. Schiller, on the other hand, is perfectly right in his contention that our individual has not kept pace with our collective culture, and it has certainly not improved during the 120 years that have passed since Schiller wrote. Rather the reverse. For if we had not wandered even farther into the collective atmosphere to the prejudice of individual development, the violent reactions which took shape in the mind of a Stirner or a Nietzsche would scarcely have been required. Still today, therefore, Schiller's words must remain both timely and valid. Like the ancients, who with a view to individual development catered for the claims of an upper class by an almost total suppression of the great majority of the common people, helots and slaves, the subsequent Christian world reached a condition of collective culture through an identical process, albeit translated as far as possible into the individual sphere, or raised to the subjective level as we might prefer to express it. While the value of the individual was proclaimed to be an imperishable soul by the Christian dogma, it became no longer possible for the inferior majority of the people to be suppressed for the freedom of a superior minority. But now the superior function was preferred over the inferior functions in the individual. In this way, the chief importance was transferred to the one valued function, to the prejudice of all the rest. Psychologically, this meant that the external form of society in antique civilization was translated into the subject, whereby in individual psychology, an inner condition was produced which had been external in the older civilization, namely, a dominating preferred function which became developed and differentiated at the expense of an inferior majority. By means of this psychological process, a collective culture gradually came into existence in which le droit de l'homme certainly had an immeasurably greater guarantee than with the ancients. But it had this disadvantage, that it depended upon a subjective slave culture, that is, upon a transfer of the antique majority enslavement into the psychological sphere, whereby collective culture was undoubtedly enhanced, while individual culture depreciated. Just as the enslavement of the mass was an open wound in the antique world, the enslavement of the inferior function is an ever-bleeding wound in the soul of man today. Quote, one-sidedness in the exercise of his powers leads in the individual infallibly to error, but in the race to truth, end quote, says Schiller. The favoritism of the superior function is just as serviceable to society as it is prejudicial to the individuality. This prejudicial effect has reached such a pitch that the great organizations of our present-day civilization actually strive for the complete disintegration of the individual, since their very existence depends upon a mechanical application of the preferred individual functions of men. It is not man that counts, but his one differentiated function. Man no longer appears as man in collective civilization. He is merely represented by a function. Nay, further, he is even exclusively identified with his function and denies any responsible membership to the other inferior functions. Thus, the modern individual sinks to the level of a mere function, because this it is that represents a collective value and alone affords a possibility of livelihood. But, as Schiller clearly discerns, differentiation of function could have come about in no other way. Quote, "There was no other means to develop man's manifold capacities than to set them one against another. This antagonism of human qualities is the great instrument of culture. It is the only instrument, however, for so long as it endures, man is only upon the way to culture." End quote. According to this conception, the present state of warring capacities could not yet be a state of culture, but only a stage on the way. Opinion will, of course, be divided about this, for by culture one man will understand a state of collective culture, while another will merely regard this as civilization and will ascribe to culture the sterner demands of individual development. Schiller is, of course, mistaken when he exclusively allies himself with the second standpoint and contrasts our collective culture with that of the individual Greek, since he overlooks the defectiveness of the civilization of that time, which renders the absolute validity of that culture very questionable. Hence, no culture is ever really complete that swings toward a one-sided orientation. That is, when at one time the cultural ideal is extroverted, the chief value being given to the object and the objective relation, while at another the ideal is introverted, when the supreme importance lies with the individual or subject and his relation to the idea. In the former case, culture takes on a collective character, while in the latter an individual. One can easily understand, therefore, that it was through the operation of the Christian sphere, whose principle is Christian love, and also through contrast association with its counterpart, which is to say, the violation of the individuality, that a collective culture came about in which the individual threatens to be swallowed up and individual values are depreciated on principle. Hence there arose in the time of the German classics that extraordinary yearning for the antique, which was for them a symbol of individual culture, and on that account was, for the most part, very much overvalued and often grossly idealized. Not a few attempts were even made to imitate or recapture the spirit of Greece, attempts which nowadays appear to us somewhat silly, but which nonetheless must be valued as the forerunners of an individual culture. In the 120 years which have passed since Schiller's time, conditions in respect to individual culture have become not better, but worse, since individual interest is today engrossed to a far greater extent in collective preoccupations, and therefore much less leisure is available for the development of individual culture. Hence, we possess today a highly developed collective culture, which in organization far exceeds anything that ever existed, but which, for that very reason, has become increasingly injurious to individual culture. There exists a deep gulf between what a man is and what he represents, that is, between the man as an individual and his function capacity as a collective being. His function is developed at the expense of his individuality. Should he excel, he is merely identical with his collective function. But should he not, then, although certainly esteemed as a function in society, he is, as an individuality, wholly on the side of his inferior, undeveloped functions, and therefore simply barbarous, whereas the former has more fortunately deceived himself concerning his actual existing barbarism. This one-sidedness has undoubtedly yielded not inconsiderable advantages to society, which has thereby gained acquisitions that could have been won in no other way. As Schiller finally observes, quote, "Only by focusing the whole energy of our mind and knitting together our entire nature in one unique faculty, do we, as it were, give wings to this individual gift and bring it by artifice far beyond the limits which nature seems to have laid down for it." End quote. But this one-sided development must inevitably lead to a reaction, since the repressed inferior functions cannot be indefinitely excluded from common life and development. The time will come when the cleavage in the inner man must again be resolved, that the undeveloped may be granted an opportunity to live. I have already alluded to the fact that the differentiation of function in civilized development ultimately affects a dissociation of the basic functions of the psyche, thus in a certain measure transcending the differentiation of capacity, and even encroaching upon the provenance of psychological attitude in general, which governs the whole manner and character of the application of capacity. By this means, culture affects a differentiation of that function which already enjoys a better development through heredity. In one man, it is the function of thought, in another, feeling, which is especially accessible to further development. Thus it happens that the urge of cultural demands engages the individual's special concern with the development of that capacity which nature has already intended as his most favorable line. But this capacity for development does not mean that the function has an a priori claim to any particular fitness. It merely presupposes, one might almost say, on the contrary, a certain functional delicacy, lability, and plasticity. On this account, the highest individual value is not by any means always to be sought or found in this function, but just insofar as it is developed for a collective end, it may possibly yield the highest collective value. But it may well be the case, as already observed, that far higher individual values lie hidden among the neglected functions, which, although of small importance for the collective life, are of the very greatest value to individual development. These, therefore, represent a living value which can endow the life of the individual with an intensity and beauty that he will vainly seek in his collective function. The differentiated function certainly procures for him the possibility of collective existence, but not that satisfaction and joy of life which the development of individual values alone can give. Their absence is often sensed as something deeply lacking, and the severance from them is like an inner division which, with Schiller, one might compare with a painful wound. Quote, "Thus, however much may be gained for the world at large by the separate development of human capacities, it cannot be denied that the individuals affected by it suffer under the curse of this general aim. Athletic bodies are certainly built up by means of gymnastic exercises, but beauty is won only through the free and uniform play of the limbs. In the same way, the tension of individual mental powers can produce extraordinary men, but it is only the uniform temperature of the same that can give man happiness and fulfillment. And in what sort of relation should we stand to past and coming ages if the development of human nature compelled us to such a sacrifice? We would become the thralls of mankind. Thousands of years long for humanity's sake, we would be doing slave labor, and have imprinted upon our crippled nature the shameful brand of this servitude, only that some later generation might nurse its moral health in blissful leisure and unfold the ample spread of its humanity. But can it be that man is destined, for any aim whatsoever, to neglect himself? Can nature with her aims rob us of that perfection which the aims of reason prescribe for us? It must therefore be false that the development of individual capacities necessitates the sacrifice of their totality, or, even if the law of nature still pressed towards such a goal, we must never relinquish that totality of our nature which cunning art has demolished, but which a still higher art may reestablish." End quote. It is evident that Schiller in his personal life had a profound sense of this conflict, and that it was just this antagonism in himself which begat a longing to seek that coherence and uniformity which should bring deliverance to the wasting and enslaved functions and a restoration of harmonious life. This is also the impelling motive in Wagner's Parsifal, where it receives symbolical expression in the restitution of the missing spear and the healing of the wound. What Wagner attempted to say in artistic, symbolic expression, Schiller labored to formulate in philosophical thought. Although it is nowhere frankly stated, the implication is clear enough that his problem revolves around the possibility of resuming the classical manner and conception of life, from which one is obliged to conclude that he either overlooks the Christian solution of his problem or deliberately ignores it. In any case, his mind is more focused upon classical beauty than upon the Christian doctrine of redemption, which, nevertheless, has no other aim but the solution of that self-same problem in which Schiller himself travailed, that is to say, the deliverance from evil. "The heart of man is filled with raging battle," says Julian the Apostate in his discourse upon King Helios, and these words significantly mark his insight not only into his own problems, but into that of his whole time, namely, that inner laceration of the latter classical epoch, which found its outward expression in an unexampled, chaotic confusion of hearts and minds, and from which the Christian doctrine promised deliverance. What Christianity gave was, of course, not a solution, but a redemption, a detachment of one valuable function from all the other functions which, at that time, made an equally peremptory claim for its share in government. Christianity gave one definite direction, to the exclusion of every other possible direction. This may have been the essential reason why the possibility of salvation that Christianity offered was passed by Schiller in silence. The pagans' near contact with nature seemed to promise just that possibility which Christianity did not offer. Quoting Schiller again, "Nature, in her physical creation, shows us the way which man has to travel in the moral world. Not until the battle of elemental forces is spent in the lower organizations does she mount to the noble form of physical man. In the same way, this elemental strife in the ethical man, this conflict of blind instincts, must first be assuaged. Man must end the crude antagonism in himself before he can venture to unfold his own diversity. Upon the other hand, the independence of his character must be assured, and submissiveness to strange despotic forms have given place to a decent freedom before man may subject the diversity in himself to the unity of the ideal." End quote. Thus, it is not to be a detachment or redemption of the inferior function, but an acknowledgement of it, a coming to terms with it, as it were, which reconciles the opposites upon the natural way. But Schiller feels that the acceptance of the inferior function might lead to a conflict of blind instincts, just as, only vice versa, the unity of the ideal might reestablish that priority of the superior over the inferior function, and thereby once again precipitate the original state of affairs. The inferior functions are opposed to the superior, not so much in their essential nature, but as a result of their actual, momentary form. They were originally neglected and repressed because they hindered civilized man in the attainment of his aims. But these correspond with one-sided interests and are by no means synonymous with the consummation of human individuality. If this were the aim, these unacknowledged functions would be indispensable, and as a matter of fact, their nature does not contradict such an end. But so long as the goal of culture does not coincide with the ideal of individuality, these functions are also subjected to a depreciation, which means a decline into relative repression. The conscious acceptance of the repressed functions is synonymous with civil war, or with the unlocking of previously coupled antitheses, whereby independence of character is immediately abolished. This independence can be reached only by a settlement of this conflict, which appears to be impossible without despotic jurisdiction over the antagonizing forces. But thereby freedom is compromised, without which the constitution of a morally free personality is inconceivable. But if one preserves freedom, one is delivered over to the conflict of instincts. Quoting Schiller again, "Upon the one hand, in his recoil from liberty, who in her first essays ever wears the semblance of an enemy, man will throw himself into the arms of a comfortable servitude, while upon the other, reduced to despair by a pedantic tutelage, he will escape into the wild unrestraint of the state of nature. Usurpation will evoke the weakness of human nature, while insurrection its dignity, until finally blind force, the great sovereign of all human affairs, will intervene and, like a common pugilist, decide the ostensible battle of principles." End quote. The contemporary revolution in France gave to this statement a living, albeit a bloody, background. Begun in the name of philosophy and reason, with loftily soaring idealism, it ended in a bloodthirsty chaos from which arose the despotic genius of Napoleon. The goddess of reason proved herself powerless against the might of the unchained beast. Schiller feels the defeat of reason and truth, and therefore has to postulate that truth itself shall become a force. Quote, "If she has hitherto evinced so little of her conquering power, the fault lies not so much with the intellect that knew not how to unveil her, as with the heart that shut her out, and with the instinct that did not work for her. Then whence this still prevailing prejudice, this intellectual darkness, beside all the light enthroned by philosophy and experience? The age is enlightened, knowledge has been found and is publicly accessible. This should at least suffice to correct our practical principles. The spirit of free research has destroyed the illusions which so long barred the approach to truth. It has undermined the ground upon which fanaticism and fraud had built their thrones. Reason has purged herself of sense delusion and false sophistries. Even philosophy, which at first made us desert her, calls us with loud insistence back to the bosom of nature. Whence comes it, then, that we are still barbarians?" End quote. In these words of Schiller, we can feel the nearness of the French Enlightenment and the fantastic intellectualism of the Revolution. The age is enlightened. What a strange overvaluation of the intellect! The spirit of free research has destroyed the illusions. What rationalism! One is vividly reminded of the words of the Procto-Phantasmists, "Vanish, we have enlightened." If, on the one hand, men at that time were too fain to overestimate the importance and efficacy of reason, quite forgetting that if reason really possessed such a power, she had long had the amplest opportunity to manifest it. On the other hand, the fact must not be overlooked that not all of the authoritative minds of that time held this view. Consequently, this soaring of a rationalistic intellectualism may well have sprung from an especially strong subjective development of this element in Schiller himself. In him, we have to reckon with a predominance of the intellect, not at the expense of his poetic intuition, but at the cost of feeling. To Schiller himself, it seemed as though there were a perpetual conflict between imagination and abstraction, that is, between intuition and intellect. Thus he writes to Goethe on the 31st of August, 1794, quote, "This it is which gave me, especially in early years, a certain awkwardness both in speculation and in the realm of poetry. As a rule, the poet would overtake me when I would be the philosopher, and the philosophic spirit would hold me when I would be the poet. Even yet it happens often enough that imaginative power disturbs my abstraction, and cold reasoning my poetry." End quote. His extraordinary admiration of Goethe's mind, and his almost feminine appreciation of his friend's intuition, to which he often gives expression in his letters, rests upon a penetrating perception of this conflict, which must have seemed redoubled in himself in contrast to the almost completely synthetic nature of Goethe. This conflict was due to the psychological circumstance that the energy of feeling gave itself in equal measure both to the intellect and to the creative imagination. Schiller seems to have appreciated this fact, for in the same letter to Goethe, he makes the observation that no sooner has he begun to know and to use his moral forces, which should apportion reasonable limits to the rival claims of imagination and intellect, than a physical illness threatens to shatter them. For it is the characteristic, already frequently alluded to, of an imperfectly developed function, that it withdraws itself from conscious disposition, and with its own impetus, that is, with a certain autonomy, becomes unconsciously implicated with other functions, whereby, without any sort of differentiated choice, it behaves as a purely dynamic factor. It might well be described as an impetus or reinforcement, which lends the conscious differentiated function the character of being carried away or coerced, so that, in one case, the conscious function is seduced beyond the limits set by purpose and decision. In another, it is held up before the attainment of its goal and led away upon a bypath, while, in a third case, it is brought into conflict with the other conscious functions, a conflict which remains unresolved so long as the unconsciously implicated and disturbing instinctive force is not differentiated in its own right and subjected as such to a certain conscious disposition. Thus one is almost driven to assume that the cry, "Whence comes it then that we are still barbarians?" is no mere reflection of the spirit of that age, but also springs from Schiller's subjective psychology. Like other men of his time, he too sought the root of the evil in the wrong place, for at no time did barbarism consist in a state where reason or truth have an insufficient effect. It appears only when man expects such an effect from them, or, we might even say, it is because man provides reason with too much efficacy from a superstitious overvaluation of truth. Barbarism is one-sidedness, lack of moderation, bad proportion generally. In the impressive example of the French Revolution, which had just then reached the culminating point of terror, Schiller could see to what extent the goddess of reason held sway in man, and how far the unreasoning beast was triumphant. It was doubtless these events of Schiller's epoch which urged the problem upon him with especial force, for it frequently happens that, when a problem that is at bottom personal, and therefore apparently subjective, impinges upon outer events which contain the same psychological element as the personal conflict, it is suddenly transformed into a general question that embraces the whole of society. In this way, the personal problem gains a dignity that was hitherto wanting, since a state of inner discord has an almost mortifying and degrading quality, so that one sinks into a humiliated condition both without and within, like a state dishonored by civil war. It is this that makes one shrink from displaying before a larger public a purely personal conflict, provided, of course, that one does not suffer from an over-daring self-esteem. But when it happens that the connection between the personal problem and the larger contemporary events is discerned and understood, a relativity is established that promises release from the isolation of the purely personal. In other words, the subjective problem is amplified to the dimensions of a general question of our society. This is no small gain as regards the possibility of a solution. For, whereas the rather meager energy of conscious interest in one's own person was hitherto the only source available for the personal problem, there is now assembled the combined forces of collective instinct, which flow in and unite with the interests of the ego. Thus, a new situation is brought about which offers new possibilities of a solution. For what would never have been possible to personal will or courage is made possible by the force of collective instinct. It bears a man over obstacles which his own personal energy could never overcome. We are therefore prompted to conjecture that it was largely the impressions of contemporary events that gave Schiller the courage to undertake this attempt to solve the conflict between the individual and the social function. The same antagonism was also deeply sensed by Rousseau. Indeed, it was the starting point of his work, Emile de l'Éducation, of 1762. Several passages are to be found in it which have interest for our problem. Given in translation, quote, "Man as a citizen is only a fractional unity dependent upon a denominator, and his value lies in his relation with the whole, which is society. Those institutions are good which best understand how to change the nature of man, how to take from him his absolute existence unto himself, and give him a relative one, how, in short, to translate the ego to a common unity. He who wishes to preserve in his life as a citizen the supremacy of natural feelings knows not what he wants. Ever in contradiction with himself, ever hovering between his inclinations and his duties, he will become neither man nor citizen. He will be useless both to himself and others." End quote. Rousseau opens his work with the famous sentence, again in translation, "Everything as it leaves the hands of the author of things is good. Everything degenerates under the hands of man." End quote. This statement is characteristic, not for Rousseau alone, but for that whole epoch. End of section 10.